Letters during the American Civil War. During the American Civil War, which took place from 1861 to 1865, letters were exchanged by Hiram Scott, a man living in Kentucky, Elijah Gibbons, a farmer in Maryland, and Alexander King, an active Union soldier. These men described their hardships, day-to-day lives, and feelings through chains of letters. In one of the many letters, Alexander King is writing from Elmira, a prison camp in New York. He is struggling for money and is desperate for food. His cousin, Elijah Gibbons, is on the receiving end of this letter, and King is exhilarated to be reading letters from him. King exclaims, "You cannot imagine, neither can I describe the pleasure it affords me to read letters from you." King is curious of the conditions back home, especially about money, though he is unwilling to accept any. Friends and family back home have seemed to forgotten about King, and he promptly asks Gibbons for an explanation of the lack of communication. He signs off the letter hoping to hear back soon and sends his regards to his loved ones.
By examining the timeline of the American Civil War, one can understand what Alexander King, a Union soldier writing letters to his family, was experiencing in his country at the time. The Civil War began in 1861 over the issue of slavery. The events leading up to the state would bring about issues of equality and nationalism. Americans had to decide whether they would be a confederacy of individual states governing themselves or a union with one national government. However, after winning their independence from Great Britain in 1776, the United States began to focus on expanding throughout North America, which ultimately came along with the trade of slaves. Now came the question of whether or not slavery would be allowed. The states in the North were against this idea of slavery. However, the South wished for more slaves. This disagreement between the states worsened when Abraham Lincoln proposed that slavery be abolished. Southern states were angry at this idea, and once Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas declared their secession. As a result, the North was henceforth known as the Union, and the South was known as the Confederacy. Lincoln made efforts for the country to remain a union while also keeping slavery out of the picture. Instead, the Battle of Fort Sumter took place in April 1861, triggering the Civil War. In one of his letters, dated March 12, 1965, King explains how, quote, "Confederate is worth nothing," revealing he must have been a Union soldier. Knowing King was a part of the Union, and that this letter was written from the Elmira prison camp in New York, it is highly likely that he was a worker at this camp, imprisoning Confederate soldiers. As a part of the Union, King believed in the abolishment of slavery. He explains his political stance by describing how the U.S. was, quote, "once happy, but now distracted and disrupted," and even calls the president a, quote, "kangaroo." He was clearly unhappy with the current situation in his country and was disappointed in its leaders. Furthermore, in his letter dated May 14, 1861, King describes the events going on at the time. Specifically, he explains the question of whether Missouri and Kentucky were going to secede from the Union. In regards to Missouri and Kentucky, King says, quote, "I can't say whether they will pass an ordinance of secession or not, and they are waiting to be kicked out." Later that year, it was decided that the two states would not secede, and they remained under Union control. Examining King's writing also reveals his level of education. There are numerous spelling and grammar mistakes throughout his letter. For example, instead of Illinois, King spells Illinois, and instead of North Carolina, he spells North Carolina. In addition, there are multiple run-on sentences and places where capitalization, vowels, and commas are missing.
The abolishment of slavery was a tough concept to grasp by Southern states. Slaves were profitable, viable, and most importantly was the majority of the nation's capital. The abolishment of slavery would not be possible without the total nation's support. The North was pro-abolishment, and the South was pro-slavery, with the South being mainly populated with plantations and the main industry being crop production. The South could not fathom a lifestyle without slave labor. The North, due to its advances and reliance on industrialization, had no need for slavery and felt it was cruel and inhumane. Through the long 4 years of war and hardship, nearly 650,000 Union and Confederate lives were lost. In addition, thousands of soldiers were held in prison camps as prisoners of war or worked the camps with the same experiences as Alexander King. From 1861 to 1863, the Confederacy seemed to have the upper hand, and the Union was losing hope. It was not until the Battle of Gettysburg that the South would take such a defeat that they would never recover from. Alongside this harsh battle, Lincoln implemented the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves in the South.
During the Civil War, many soldiers were kept in prison camps where they would be treated unfairly by soldiers such as Alexander King and housed in poor living conditions. Prisons have never been fully equipped to house prisoners, and to this day, they are still not fully capable of giving prisoners what they need. Prisons dating back all the way to 1860, when the Civil War began, were built as camps opposed to prisons, and the needs of the prisoners were never met. Prisoners during this time were crammed into pre-existing structures and fortresses that did not have adequate supplies for the incoming captives. Unlike prisoners today, they were not prepared to house, feed, clothe, and give medical treatment for those who needed it. As King said in his letter, "If you can conveniently, I would be glad if you would send me a box of eatables. You can send them by express. I don't wish you to put yourself through any trouble." Even the prison supervisors, like King, were in need of food, as they were not given an adequate supply. During the Civil War, flimsy sheds were built to house prisoners, and they were built very close together. Many hostages were sent from prison to prison, never staying at a camp for longer than a few weeks.
The lifestyle of the prisoners at the camp, Elmira Prison in New York, was one of unbearable conditions in a harsh environment. Prison workers had to control the prisoners in massive groups. The maximum capacity held for the prison was 5,000, and the most prisoners held there at once was 9,441. One prisoner even claimed Elmira was nearer Hades than I thought any place could be. Of the 4 other prison camps in New York, Elmira was described as the worst of them all. The colonels at the camp struggled with making more room for incoming prisoners with already being over capacity. Colonel Eastman even had to complain to Washington authorities that the camp was overcrowded and then request them to stop sending more prisoners. Another major issue was the rapid spread of illness among prison workers and the prisoners. There were multiple ponds inside the camp that were used for drainage, and they had turned into a cesspool which caused extreme illness throughout the camp.
When the letter was written, King was among the many soldiers living in the hostile environment, even though he was a prison worker and of higher social rank. In the letter, King is describing living conditions and sharing information with Elijah Gibbons, who received the letter. King writes, "You asked me if money would be of use to me. It would indeed, and I thank you for your kind offer, but you need send me none, as I expect to be exchanged in the course of a month. I could buy anything I wanted with greenbacks here, but Confederate is worth nothing." King goes on to write that Confederates are worth nothing in the prison he is working in. Elmira, the prison camp King was working in, had an insufficient amount of food and had an outbreak of smallpox and pneumonia, along with flooding from a nearby river, leaving 2,963 prisoners dead by the time it closed.
The Civil War was a pivotal point in American society. The issue of slavery caused hardship and controversy, breaking apart the nation. Many people suffered being held as prisoners of war, and thousands of lives were lost. The prisons had insufficient funds, basic needs, and housing. Elmira Prison in New York was a place of suffering for Alexander King. He endured the harsh conditions of famine, illness, and overcrowding, yet stayed hopeful and explained how joyous he felt to read letters from his family. He asked his cousins about his friends and his family back home and sends his kindest regards. By examining King's language in his letter, it is clear that he misses home but is trying to make the best out of his situation. He knows he is fighting for his country, and this is something that he is proud of. Like King, many soldiers during the Civil War were willing to die in battle for either the Confederacy or the Union. Faced with death and daily hardships, King is a perfect example of these soldiers who truly embodied courage.